This is an extract from the Leader Coronavirus Daily podcast by the Evening Standard and hosted by me, David Marsland. To hear the whole thing, search for it on your podcast provider.
I now call the Prime Minister to make his statement. Prime Minister
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will make a statement on our response to the rising number of coronavirus cases and how we must act now to avoid still graver consequences later on.
In the House of Commons, Boris Johnson insisted the country is not going into full lockdown, but the measures are draconian. 10 p.m. curfews on pubs backed up by fines and threats to shut down offenders. Masks have to be worn in restaurants, including when going to the toilet. You also need one in a taxi or private car hire. Wedding guest numbers have been halved from 30 to 15, but funerals are exempt from that. Plans to allow people back to Premier League matches have been scrapped. And after months of telling people to go back to the office, the guidance is now, don't. And for quite a while.
Mr. Speaker, we will spare no effort in developing vaccines, treatments, new forms of mass testing. But unless we palpably make progress, we should assume that the restrictions I have announced will remain in place for perhaps 6 months.
Our editorial column says the Prime Minister's had his say. Now let's hear from the Chancellor.
Even as the government ramps up its anti-virus strategy, it is preparing to ramp down its economic one of support. In the coming days, Rishi Sunak must step up and tell us how he will use the Treasury's clout to soften the coming blow to the economy. There are many good businesses with bright long-term futures that deserve help. Allow them to collapse now, and we will regret it in decades hence. After 9/11, people declared we would never work in skyscrapers again, or board aeroplanes. So while market forces should be allowed to prevail in general, the Chancellor must continue to offer a helping hand.
The Evening Standard's Jonathan Prynn is with me. Jonathan, we've got curfews, fines, don't go back to the office. Wedding guest lists are being ripped up right now, and it's going to go on for 6 months. How is this going to affect the UK's economy? How is it going to affect the people who live here?
It's a massive backward step. I think people will look back on the heady days of August when we seemed to be emerging from the sort of chrysalis of lockdown in the beautiful weather. We were all being paid £10 to go and eat out to help out, and it all felt like a sort of a brave new world almost. But this feels like, winter is coming, and it's coming very quickly. It's going to be devastating, I fear, for much of central London, and very tough for the country as a whole.
We're seeing some of the continuing effects of the first lockdown coming through, aren't we? With Whitbread, which owns places like Premier Inn and Brewers Fayre, they're announcing 6,000 redundancies. That came even before the Prime Minister's announcement today.
Yes, and what we're seeing in those sorts of announcements, as you say, is the knock-on effect from the first round of restrictions and the lockdown, which in the case of Whitbread resulted in I think it was 76 or 77% fall in revenue in the first half of their financial year. I think most people had hoped that, yes, the first half of the year would be, we knew that was going to be horrendous, but the slope of the second stroke of the V, as it were, would be quite steep, and that the bounce back and recovery would be rapid and strong. That now looks very unlikely. It looks like we will at best probably bump along the bottom for over the winter. But given that we've already lost more than 10% of economic output this year, it's really, really heavy news, I think. And sadly, I think by the end of the year, we're going to be looking at huge levels of unemployment, huge levels of business failure, insolvencies and bankruptcies and so on, and a really tough outlook.
And this work from home guidance, how's that going down with businesses and with people who were going back into the office, Jonathan? Because we've had for months now, get back to work, go back to the office. We've had companies spending lots of money to make sure their offices are safe. We've had people going onto the tube and taking the risks of catching coronavirus to get to the office because they were told it was a good thing to do, and now they're being told, go home.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very confusing message. It's very, very difficult for people. I think most people will probably now take the view that they will just stay at home. There's no point in I think the government messaging is now in a way quite undermined, that people just take a fairly long-term view. Oh, the government doesn't know what's going on. I'm going to stay at home. I can do my job from home, and that's where I'm safest. That's where I've been for the last 6 months. And I think the job of getting people back into the office when this is all finally over is going to be that much harder now, simply because people don't trust the messaging that things are getting better, because they just think things are going to get worse again.
And will there be more pressure on the government, particularly on the Chancellor, to come up with more measures like the furlough scheme, which is coming to an end, or Eat Out to Help Out, which help people? Is the government going to have to conjure up something new to get through this?
I think inevitably it's going to have to, for some specific parts of the economy that are particularly badly hit, because we thought initially that this was going to be a relatively short a set of emergency measures that would be followed by a rebound in the autumn and so on, which obviously isn't going to happen. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, sort of threw everything in his armoury at lockdown 1.0, which means that the public borrowing figures are going to be off the scale, catastrophic this year. 350 billion of borrowing maybe. The measures are going to have to be much smaller scale, much more targeted, and much cheaper, frankly. Furlough, for example, I think that's unlikely to be repeated or even extended. That's going to leave people much more exposed to the really cold, chilly winds of economic reality that come with this pandemic.
Search for the Leader Coronavirus Daily on any podcast provider to hear more from the podcast.